This is my book report presentation for The Molecule of More for Bio 328. Okay, so the authors of this book are actually very well educated. First, we have Daniel Lieberman, who's a psychiatrist. He's also a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and he also teaches at Washington State University. He's done TED Talks and he's won multiple awards as well. And then the co-author is Michael Long. He was trained as a physicist, and then he became a screenwriter, and he started writing novels as well. So obviously they wrote this book because it applies to psychiatry, especially from Dr. Lieberman's standpoint, and he's been researching in this field for a very long time. And of course, the molecule of more, it's referring to dopamine, and that's a huge topic when it comes to behavior and function. So the goal of this book was to display the human condition through dopamine. And the human condition involves just the overall emotion of someone, their motivation, any conflict they can go through, any distress, and it also touches on creativity and madness. And we'll see that in a little bit. So at the beginning of the book, in the introductory section, it distinguishes up versus down chemicals. So down chemicals are literally when you look down, you can see your hands, your feet, you can hold food. It's what's attainable, it's temporary, and the book refers to it as here and now chemicals also. And there's multiple neurotransmitters involved with it, like serotonin and oxytocin and some others. Up chemicals are when you look up and you see the sky and you see a kite. You can't reach it. They're out of your reach. They're provoking, they're unpredictable, and it's all through dopamine. So there were a lot of themes in the book. Just to make it a little bit more digestible, I focused on 3 of them. One, obviously, being the human behavior. The second being addiction and cravings, which is a big one, especially considering it's dopamine and it's involved in addiction. A lot of people associate it with that. And then creativity and madness, just because I thought it was creativity and madness was interesting. When somebody thinks of dopamine, they don't really think of creativity and madness. That's why I wanted to include it. So human behavior, a little bit more on down chemicals. They fulfill the temporary desires. Okay, so the book mentions them as present-oriented, what's in front of you. They can be done temporarily. They're not hard to find. They're not hard to do. And that contrasts with the up chemical, which is dopamine. It makes you want unfamiliar things. It's an anticipation molecule, so it wants what's next. It gets excited when it doesn't know what's going to happen. So yeah, it favors unpredictability, and it will shape your behavior in terms of creativity and motivation. Now I want to move over to addiction and cravings. As we all know, drugs are major dopamine triggers, and they trigger dopamine harder than any natural stimulants. And by natural stimulants, I mean survival, food, sex, because our ancestors, right, during evolutionary times, their dopamine kicked off because they needed to survive. That's what got them motivated. That's what got them moving to hunt for food. So we still have that inside of us, except we don't really have a problem finding food anymore. So with all the extra dopamine, and especially with the time we live in today, drugs aren't very hard to get. Now, furthermore, tolerance develops when you take too much dopamine. There's two reasons for tolerance developing. One reason is physiologically, at the chemical level, there's a lower drug intake. So the more drugs you take, over time, those dopamine receptors aren't going to be able to hold on to those drugs anymore. And when they can't do that, you're going to need to have more drugs to get in as much dopamine as you can. So that's why tolerance develops and you have to keep taking more drugs. Now, the second part of it is unfamiliarity. We kind of touched on this earlier, in that if you take a drug enough, when you take it again, you know what's going to happen to you and it becomes predictable. And now you want something more. You want a higher dose just because you want to anticipate what it's going to feel like, or you want an entirely different drug. You know, the book mentions that drug abuse, it's like an ever-growing disease, like a cancer almost. So it starts off in an initial phase and it keeps growing and growing and growing. So when somebody pays for drugs rather than paying their bills, to them, to dopamine, that's completely normal. Because why do you need to pay your bills? Dopamine is better. And this keeps happening until it just takes over every aspect of their lives. And unfortunately, we see that a lot. I want to go into the physiology behind this. Dopamine is produced at the nucleus accumbens via the mesolimbic pathway. The mesolimbic pathway in the book, it's described as the desire circuit. That's another name for it. The scientific name for it is the mesolimbic pathway. There's a lot of dopamine pathways over here. I wanted to focus on this one. As we can see, the blue lines over here indicate dopamine. And all right, well, yeah, and then the NAC, this is what the nucleus accumbens is. So basically, you're gonna get signals over here, and the nucleus accumbens is gonna produce dopamine. The nucleus accumbens is like the primary dopamine producing area in your brain. And you know, you can see the other pathways over here as well. Okay, now I wanted to touch on creativity and madness. So this is the third of the three themes we're gonna cover. Creativity and madness. What I like this topic because the book says that creativity and mental illness are complete opposites, but they're interconnected by dopamine. So they're trying to find the connection here. So they concluded that let's go to schizophrenic patients and find out, because they exhibit erratic behavior and they exhibit what we call madness. So let's see what's present in their brains. Okay, so there's something called salience and there's something called low latent inhibition. Okay, and what that is because of the dopamine's effect, low latent inhibition is when you take in everything that's irrelevant as relevant. So things that are similar or familiar, you take as new. So if I'm, you know, walking down the street and I see a mailbox, I've seen that mailbox 1,000 times already growing up, but I still look at it like it's something new. And meanwhile, I'm not focusing on the stop sign over there, you know? So it'll drive someone out of their mind when all this stimuli are just crowding their mind. Now, the opposite of that is an individual that's very creative. They have latent inhibition, so they are able to separate what's important and unimportant. And if they do that, they can form cohesive ideas and you know, make developments. So the takeaways I have from this book are some critiques and some compliments. So the book was a little hard to read because there were a lot of examples. The authors did mention in their introductory note that they tried to oversimplify and they tried to make it easier to read, but they just provided way too many examples. Like it was tiring almost going through all of them. And then the other problem I had was there was no clear citations. So as I'm reading, I'm going through these studies and I'm going through these case scenarios and there's no reference. Now at the end of every chapter, there's a further reading section, like a recommended reading section, and that could probably double as a works cited page. But to go into that and find out if that is the works cited page, if those are the references, is just, it's too much work for the reader, you know, especially for an academic book like this. They should have had active citations as they were writing. The last critique I have was that the ideas were kind of vague, like the creativity and madness theme I covered. This was a little hard to interpret. Like I really had to investigate what they meant here because they weren't very clear. I had to read the page several times just to understand where's the connection with dopamine between schizophrenic patients and creative people. So I wish that would have been a little bit more clear. There were other instances like that as well. I do have some compliments for the authors. Um, there was some sarcasm and humor, and that made it fun to read, and it made it hard to not lose attention. So that's good. They included figures, and their chapters were divided into subsections, so you could kind of, the structure was a little bit better, and it was kind of easier to follow that way, and it's thought provoking. By that, it makes me consider my future actions. Are my future actions going to be dictated by um, an overuse of dopamine? Because we're all going to use it, obviously. That, I mean, it's not even a behavioral thing. It's even involved in motor movement. So obviously that's going to happen. 110%, we're going to use it. But are we going to overuse it to the point where we get addicted to something? Are we going to underuse it to the point where we just do nothing and stay home and do nothing all day? So yeah, it makes me consider my future, really. And I would recommend this to people in like professional fields that are in like the biology or chemistry field, especially. I wouldn't really recommend it to just anybody. I would recommend it to someone who's actually wants to learn about this stuff. Otherwise, I don't think it'd be a good read if you're not interested in this. But yeah, that is all. I'm gonna stop share and stop recording.